whether you like it or not, and whether you think that the motives of the guys inside the walls were pure and honest, these guys were willing to stand up for what they believed. And any example of that in human history lifts our souls. I mean, it's an apotheosis where all of a sudden we are better than our base selves.
The Texas Hill Country is one of the most beautiful places on earth. In this podcast, recent Hill Country resident Tom Fox visits with the people and organizations that make this one of the most unique areas of Texas. Join Tom as he explores the people, places, and their activities of the Texas Hill Country.
So, welcome back for another episode. This is Tom Fox with the Hill Country Podcast, and today I have Don Frazier, the executive director at the Texas Center at Schreiner University. Don, first of all, welcome back.
Thank you. It's always good to be in this space with you. We always have such nice conversations.
Well, today we're going to do one in honor of the upcoming anniversary of the Alamo. I wanted to do Forget the Alamo.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I thought you'd appreciate that irony.
Yep.
And I really wanted to talk to you about this book for quite some time. I think you and I feel the same way about a lot of the parts of the book. But maybe we can start off with the history part, because there were a couple of things in the history part that were new to me that really helped explain kind of what led up to the battle itself. But I wanted to start with asking you, the Constitution of 1824.
Sure.
The battle flag flown at the Alamo had 1824 on it. And why did the Americans, or I guess the Texicans at that time, look to the Constitution of 1824 as a guiding document for what they believed their role was in the country of Mexico?
That was the rule book by which they agreed to play. And so a lot of people don't realize that Mexico is pretty much at war with itself. And by that I mean there's two major political factions that have emerged after Mexican independence. One group is the Federalist, and the Federalists believe that power ought to be spread out to the various provinces, to the various states in Mexico. Essentially a federal model that they're roughly basing on the American federal model as enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. The other faction are the Centralists, and the Centralists pretty quickly give up on the idea that Mexicans are capable of self-rule. And they say, no, these people need to be handled, they don't need to be led. And we're going to do all the handling from Mexico City. So the Americans come to Texas in 1821 with this idea that they're coming in to be part of Mexico. And the development of the Constitution, the Federalist Constitution of 1824, reinforces this belief. And that's when immigration really starts to pick up. That, hey, this is a constitutional government just like we left. If not exactly like we left, close enough, we can live with it. And those were the rules that they thought they were playing by. And so when that Constitution is suspended by military warlords, in Spanish, caudillos, when the caudillos started coming in and saying, no, we're going to really be kind of warlords in Mexico City, that led to some consternation amongst these new settlers, these Americans that had just arrived, because they were going, y'all have changed the rules, and we're not crazy about it.
Let me take a step back, Don.
Yeah.
Because I think most people listening to this podcast certainly have heard of Stephen F. Austin. They are aware of what he did.
Yeah.
But he wasn't the person that really was the trailblazer that opened up the immigration. I want to talk about his father, Moses Austin.
Yeah. Well, Moses Austin was the big dreamer, schemer. And, he left Connecticut to go to work some lead mines and went into business in Missouri, which was Spanish territory at the time. So he had a long track record working with the Spanish. And his idea was he would sell this immigration scheme to the Spanish. And the Spanish were all ears. What nobody realized at the time was that they were also heading for the exits. So Moses Austin gets it sold. And with the help of Baron you've got several people that are helping him, but we've got people like the Baron de Bastrop and others that have been working with the Spanish up to that point. And so Moses Austin comes to San Antonio, pitches it, gets kind of a chilly reception, pitches it again with some folks that had better connections, and the immigration scheme is on. And, he's not – Stephen F. Austin's not even in the picture. Stephen F. Austin's moved down to New Orleans to be a lawyer. He's getting on with his life. He is, as we parents of children in their 20s say, he was launched. So he wasn't hanging around the house. But Moses Austin doesn't get to see his vision realized.
Moses Austin dies, and Stephen F. Austin takes it forward. One of the things that I garnered from this book was I did not have an appreciation of not only the political skills of Stephen F. Austin, but the leadership skills of Stephen F. Austin.
Yeah.
And he was an impresario, a true impresario. He brought the original families to the Austin colony for settlement. He negotiated with the Spanish government. He kind of kept everything in line, and also dealt with the Indian issue. But the one thing that I was not aware of or had not fully appreciated was when he went to Mexico City to try to negotiate face-to-face with the Mexican government and was imprisoned.
Yeah.
That really lifted a lid off of a lot of revolutionary sentiment in the state of Texas, or I guess the province at that time, which he had actually kept under control, and that the Mexican government made what appeared to be not only a tactical but almost a strategic error.
Huge.
By doing that. So I was wondering if you could talk about what was the political strife or life like in the Texas colonies sort of after 1830, and what got unleashed when he was in prison.
Yeah, so you're right about Stephen F. Austin. He is the great guiding light of American immigration to Texas. I mean, he did a number of things. First of all, he made sure that everybody played by the rules. They all learned Spanish. They all, were at least nominal Catholics. He was actually pretty committed Catholic. But they were following Spanish law. In fact, when Hayden Edwards tried to launch a breakaway effort, what was known as the Fredonia Rebellion, Stephen F. Austin raised the militia to go against his fellow American colonists. So here is a guy who is a rule follower, absolutely a rule follower. You talked about Indians. Stephen F. Austin is credited with starting the Texas Rangers in 1823. He said, look, we need some guys to go out and range the frontier. So their bicentennial is next year. So he is playing the Mexican game because he said, fair is fair. Y'all set up these rules. I'm following the rules. We're bringing people in. We're going to turn this place into a garden spot. And then all of a sudden the ground shifted underneath him, and the government started becoming unstable, and there was a series of civil wars that essentially left him with a very unsure future on what Texas would be. So at first, the rebellion in Texas really kicks off in 1832. And people don't realize that. They always look to the Alamo like, that's when it started, and San Jacinto's when it ended. No, there was a little bit of a fuse that was lighted back in the early 1830s. And what happens is these caudillos are starting to worry about the American influence in Texas. Frankly, they had every right to, because there were so many Americans coming in that Texas had essentially become an American province. There's probably about 40,000 Americans versus about 2,500 native Tejanos. So all of a sudden it's swamped by all these guys. Now, 40,000 people spread across a big place like Texas doesn't seem all that impressive. But when you throw it as a ratio versus the natives, it's pretty impressive. And so they were worried that these guys would destabilize La Frontera, the North, and that sooner or later they would quit following the rules. So in 1830, they just said, all right, no more you guys can come in. And they started posting garrisons across Texas to keep an eye on these folks. Well, these garrisons were composed of folks that were probably not happy to be there, or they were happier to be there than the prison that they got recruited out of. And so these are not people that are inclined to encourage civil military relations to be on a very good standing. And the men that led them, like Juan Davis Bradburn at Anahuac and his garrisons, tended to try to crack heads. And when people didn't do to suit them, they'd throw them in the clink. And they started throwing people in jail like William Barrett Travis. And so, that rubbed him the wrong way. So there's an agitation that's starting to foment. Stephen F. Austin's trying to get ahead of this. Said, look, got some hotheads that have moved to Texas. And, you guys down in Mexico City, you're right. You shouldn't trust these guys because they were a pain in the neck in the U.S. or will be a pain in the neck here. But this is a small group. Most of the folks are coming to Texas to make their fortune. These guys are coming to Texas to make their reputation. That's a big difference. So Stephen F. Austin's trying to figure out how do we steer through this skid, so to speak, and essentially comes up with the idea that as long as you had Texas as a separate state within Mexico, because it was essentially an appendage of Coahuila, which meant that all of your high-level political interactions, government interactions, were a long way away in a very inconvenient place for most people living in Texas. So Stephen F. Austin said, look, we'll be our own state. We'll police our own troublemakers. It'll all be good. He takes this down to Mexico City, doesn't get a whole lot of warm reception there, and as you suggested, it eventually leads to him being thrown in the slammer without really any charges. Just, we're going to let you cool your jets down here in Mexico City, and none of the judges would ever take the case because they didn't know exactly why he was there. Why is this sort of curly-headed gringo sitting in our jail cell? We have no idea why he's here. So they kept kicking the can down the road. He languished down there, caught tuberculosis, essentially caught his death down in the prisons of Mexico. But Stephen F. Austin got turned by that experience.
He did, and that was the other point, and you just touched on it, which was he was weakened physically, so he couldn't really be the physical leader he was, but he also got turned.
He did.
And he got turned to seeing that he wasn't going to find one solid government to negotiate with, at least not so much on a level playing field, but with a playing field, with a playing book.
Yeah, with a playbook. Yeah, I mean, he could have read the playbook in either Spanish or English. The problem is there just wasn't one.
Exactly, and really that was one of the points that I had not really focused on in my study of this time of history, was that when he got turned, it really was just inevitable at that point that some spark would happen.
When he came back, he said, all right, all you guys that I thought were kind of pains in the neck, I might be on to something. This may be irreconcilable. And so he goes from being a pacifist, what would have passed for a 19th century pacifist. I mean, he's still interested in fighting off Indians and things like that. But he starts to gain more sympathy with people like Travis and Williamson and Jack and the rest of those guys that are saying, look, there's never going to be a peaceful coexistence with Mexicans in Texas. Not under this leadership. Now, that's not to say we're not going to have peaceful coexistence with Tejanos, because Tejanos are integrated at every level in this American society. Fewer in Nacogdoches, more in Bear. And that's kind of the range of it. So this is not a racial thing. This is a Mexican governmental system versus an American governmental system.
I'd like to turn to the economy now.
Sure.
And the economy of the province of Texas at that time, with starting with Stephen F. Austin and the original 300. It seems that originally he brought families over to farm. He gave them pretty fertile land in the Austin colony in Texas. Of course, that evolved. Nacogdoches and Port of Galveston was constructed. But could you walk us through the economy of the province at that time? And was it really yeoman farmer landholders moving to something bigger, or how would you characterize it?
Yeah, the answer to that is yes. I mean, they were coming for every kind of human motive that you could imagine. So one of the things that people miss is that there was a big financial panic in the United States just prior to this. And so there's a lot of people that were going broke, a lot of people that were losing their farms to their creditors. There was a lot of economic disruption in the U.S., And then all of a sudden this guy shows up and says, hey, if you'll move to Texas, it's a little rough, but if you'll come in and you'll improve it, then we're going to give you guys somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 acres, divided into a parcel that's about right for farming, about 200 acres for farming, the rest for running livestock. So it's not just farming, but it's also farming and raising horses and raising beef cattle and all that sort of stuff. So essentially we'll set you up. Not only that, we'll let you come in tax-free for the first 5 years or so. So you can get on your feet, make it productive, and then after you've had a couple of crops put in, sold some cattle to market, you'll be able to pay taxes to the government of Mexico. Everybody wins. So what do you plant on those fertile acres? Well, some people are planting feed crops to manage their livestock. Great, that makes sense. Some people are planting cotton because cotton is absolutely the oil of the 1830s. I mean, that is where the money is. Now, a lot of the folks that come to Texas come to work as common laborers on those cotton fields. But they also import enslaved labor to work on some of those cotton fields. Now, is this the majority of people? No, not really. Any time during this process do you have a majority of slave owners that are trying to turn this into a great slave empire. There are some people back east that are saying Texas would make a great place to turn into a slave state and make productive in that way. But in the 1830s, Texas is the big potential. So what do we make of this place? We don't know, but there's lots and lots there. So the people that are inclined towards raising cotton with slave labor see Texas as a great opportunity. People that are inclined to make their living by raising livestock see Texas as a great opportunity. People that want to raise wheat and corn without enslaved labor, just with their kids, all 12 of them, they see Texas as a great opportunity. Merchants, land speculators, my gosh, the number of people that come in just essentially as real estate agents are pretty impressive too. So, there's been some attempt to paint this early Texas period as a great conspiracy amongst slave owners. And I think that simplifies what was actually going on to the point of making it a caricature. There were Mexicans who really were encouraging slave labor cultured cotton. So cotton raised with enslaved labor or cotton raised with free labor. Didn't matter to them. What was important was the cotton, because Mexico didn't have two nickels to rub together. And they were looking for some way to take this place that essentially was living in the shadow of the Comanche Empire, was at the far end of any supply line you could imagine, and was in an undeveloped wilderness. They're trying to turn it into something productive. And so everybody saw what they wanted to see in Texas at that time.
And that really brings up, and you touched on it directly, my first major disagreement with the book, which is around the revolt by the Texicans being driven by slavery. I saw it being driven by economics.
Oh, sure.
And just as you articulated, because the scope of the immigration in Texas, coupled with the fact that Texas was south of the Mason-Dixon line, we had the Compromise of 1820.
Yeah.
It was going to get extended one way or the other. North didn't have the votes to block a southern state being a slave state. That part was probably going to happen anyway, but to me, the greater picture was just what you touched on, Don, which is the economics of it.
Well, and you can't invest in a place if you can't trust the rules. I mean, anybody listening to this podcast, I invite you to take the deed to your property and throw it in the fireplace and set it on fire. Remove all legal documents that say that you own your house. What's that going to do to your property value? Are you going to be able to trade that property anymore? Probably not. So in the American Constitution, there's this idea of being secure in your papers, and that things are underwritten or undergirded by this rule of law. And if rule of law is in place, then all of a sudden people will invest. And that's how real estate goes up. If you have a stable government, then people are going to say, then I'm going to move to that place. And when more people move in, the property value goes up because the resources become a little tighter. So everybody's looking at Texas as, this would be a great place if we could just get the government straight. And up until about 1829, the government looked to be pretty straight. I saying, we can live with these guys.
Let me take a quick detour. You named a town that doesn't get too much play anymore, and that's Nacogdoches.
Sure.
What was the role of Nacogdoches in Texas up to the Battle of the Alamo?
Well, Nacogdoches was the great entrepot for Texas. I mean, if you're coming to Texas, chances are you're going to go through Nacogdoches to get there. And it's still kind of that way if you're coming from Louisiana. So it was the place that became quickly Americanized. There weren't that many Tejanos living there to begin with. The history of Texas in the late Spanish colonial period was one of retreat from East Texas. And so most of the residents during the Spanish Empire got moved out of East Texas and western Louisiana and concentrated down at San Antonio. Some of them drifted back, but they're in onesies and twosies and never really rebuilt their communities like they had been. So Nacogdoches becomes a really American town with very strong American proclivities and feelings. And in many ways, you'd go to Nacogdoches and you couldn't tell if you're in Nacogdoches or Jackson, Mississippi, other than you're surrounded by trees and uncultivated soil, and Jackson, Mississippi would have been pretty well developed. But I think it's no mistake or no accident that becomes Sam Houston's sort of home base when he comes to Texas for whatever reason motivated him to come to Texas. He goes to Nacogdoches because he's amongst friends. And during the campaigns of the Texas Revolution, both the Siege of Bear in 35 and then later on the fighting that happens with the Texas Revolution in 36, Alamo, Goliad, San Jacinto, they're always looking towards East Texas to save their bacon because that's the highest concentration of population. So that's the American part of Texas.
As I recall, Nacogdoches was the end of the El Camino Real.
It was. And so actually Los Aldeas is the absolute end of the Camino Real. But nobody thinks about Los Aldeas, because it's on the other side of that Louisiana line. And so being a Texas chauvinist, our interests kind of stop at Carthage, So we're not going into Louisiana and think about Texas. But that line went all the way from nearly the Red River Valley, the cusp of the Red River Valley, all the way down to San Antonio and beyond. And so Nacogdoches was sort of the first line of civilization west of Los Aldeas. And that was sort of the supply center, the market center, and that was also a place that was always garrisoned by Spanish forces, but really Mexican forces always had some presence there. That was also where Hayden Edwards, through his Fredonia Rebellion. And so, mid-20s, everybody else is kind of getting on with the job of getting along. Hayden Edwards comes over from Mississippi and says, no, man, Nacogdoches, this doesn't even feel like Mexico. We're going to declare our own, republic here. And that little episode oftentimes gets forgotten as well. So if I was if I was a Mexican official, I would go to Nacogdoches and leave very disturbed because it did not seem like it was a Mexican town.
Let's go back to our more of our narrative. You talked about 1832 and the events going forward up to 1835 and 1836.
Yeah.
We just had a series of, it seemed to me, escalating events
leading
to 1836. But could you kind of walk us through that time frame and how these events just got a little bigger and a little uglier and a little bloodier every time?
They did. And what ends up happening is in 1832, you actually have Texians, as they called themselves. They couldn't quite figure out what to call themselves, so they settled on Texians. They were actually cheering the great Federalist leader, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. I mean, there was Texians waving their hats in the air saying, Viva Santa Anna! And they were happy to see centralist forces removed from Texas at Anahuac, at Velasco, at Nacogdoches. And they were thinking, man, the Federalists are back in charge. But what often gets missed with people that study Texas history is that Texas is part of Mexico. So to understand Texas, you got to understand Mexico. And Santa Anna, as we, Santana, if it's correctly pronounced, but, Santa Anna to those of us, he actually overthrows his own federalist government. He installs it and then decides that they're way too federalist. And so he goes and overthrows the government that he installed. And by installed, I mean he had a vice president that he put in place so that he could go home and, fight chickens and hang out at the plantation. And all of a sudden people starting to bang on his door saying, hey, this guy that you set up in Mexico City, he's reforming everything way too fast. We're all losing our stake in society. You got to come stop this monster that you unleashed on us. So he goes and overthrows the government that he put in place so he could go on vacation. And all the people that asked him to overthrow his own government said, all right, here's the government we would like. And it's a very strong centralist trend. And we want you to knock heads and start bringing in a bunch of these guys that are kind of going rogue out there in the territories. Not just Texas. Zacatecas, Durango, Yucatan. There's all sorts of Mexico that is not particularly interested in giving up on federalism. Again, this is a Mexican Civil War. So when some of the guys in Texas begin agitating, once again, it's William Barrett Travis, going back to Anahuac, firing at a Mexican garrison there from the deck of the sloop Ohio. He's actually firing cannons at the garrison there, and they all run off into the woods going, why are you shooting at us? We didn't do anything to you. All of a sudden, it appears to observers in Mexico City that we might have trouble up there. It had already been predicted that these Americans might throw the entire Mexican nation into revolution. That first prediction came down in 1829. So in 1832, there's some dust-ups. Man, they all fade. 1835, looks like the revolution's starting to heat up again. And so that little incident, coupled with the return of Stephen F. Austin, and everybody's going, yay, here's the cool head that will prevail, and we'll be able to talk our way through this big mess. And Austin looks at the assembled crowd and says, nope, Travis had it right. We should shoot cannons at these people. Everybody's like, wait, Steve, what happened, Steve? What happened to you down there in jail? Must have been bad. And so that's when the Mexicans say, look, they've thrown our garrisons out. They're shooting at us. Let's go and send a group of about 500, 800 troops to Texas, and we're going to go start disarming. We're going to go start disarming the population. We're going to make sure that our rules are enforced, and that's what leads to the October event known as the Come and Take It incident at Gonzales.
After the Come and Take It event, the Texian forces moved down to San Antonio.
They did. Well, they actually go to Goliad first. And so they take Presidio La Bahia without firing a shot, essentially just climb over the wall and say, all right, this is ours now. And the guys there are going, well, as long as you don't shoot at us, we're all for it. Let us be on our way. And so the idea then is let's go and throw the rest of the Mexican troops out from San Antonio. And it's really, let's just drive these guys out of this province. And what ends up happening is a number of dust-ups around Bexar, is what San Antonio really was called back then, San Antonio de Bexar. And most notably the Battle of Concepcion, which people don't really know about, in which the Mexicans were getting highly agitated about all these armed American colonists that were throwing their garrisons out. And they decided they were going to go put the wampus on them. And the Texians just outshot them. And they shot them up and drove them back into San Antonio. And next thing you know, you got this sort of standoff between these insurrectionists and the Mexican centralist garrison at Bexar. And it doesn't really get resolved until December, when finally the Mexican garrison there has had enough of the constant sort of skirmishing and sniping and pushing in from the north and that sort of thing. Northern suburbs, I mean, really the battlefield for the siege of Bexar happens from the downtown plazas north, with a little bit of action around the Alamo. But finally, the Mexicans have fortified Bear. So both the downtown plazas are turned into forts. The Alamo is where you station your cavalry to make sweeping patrols. So the Alamo's not that big a deal to begin with. But when the Texians are able to collapse those Mexican positions in San Antonio, in the streets of Bear, their fallback position is the Alamo. So the Mexicans are inside the Alamo, and the Texians are trying to get them out of the Alamo. So that's an Alamo story a lot of people don't realize. Finally, they say, look, we'll let you go. You just give us the Alamo. Y'all go away. We'll then operate Bear, and y'all go back to Mexico. All is well. And so they do. They really let the Mexican garrison go under very generous terms.
So what led to the concentration of the Texian forces physically at the Alamo after that, which led, of course, to the battle that we all remember?
Sure. From that point on, when the Mexican troops withdraw, the army that had first been assembled by Stephen F. Austin, before he is asked to essentially sell the revolution to an American audience by going abroad to places like New Orleans and Nashville to get financing and to raise volunteers. So Stephen F. Austin kind of exits the scene, but he did raise that army, and he did put that army in position to besiege Bear. When that siege is finally culminates in the removal of the Mexican garrison, most of the Texian volunteers say, well, it's cold, I'm going home. And so they, by and large, go home. And so at one time, there was probably about 700 Texian volunteers around Bear. And by the end of the year, early January, there's 150. And these are guys that probably didn't have a home to go to. They might have been young adventurers. Some of them had just gotten there from the U.S., and they're going, well, I've made this trip. I'm not turning around and going back to New Orleans or Natchez. I'm going to stay right here. Mobile, come on. And so you have this smaller garrison. Some of them decide, you know what, the only thing better than throwing the Mexicans out of Bear would be to invade Mexico and help our brother Federalists. And there's a long tradition of Americans helping one faction or the other, usually the Federalists, in the Mexican Civil War. So this is not an unusual response. There are volunteers that left New Orleans starting in 1813, and that tradition has continued up to 1835. So the idea of going into Mexico, helping the Federalists versus the Centralists, also bleeds off some of your troops. A bunch of those guys had this idea. They're going to Matamoros. And so what you end up having is a much too small garrison in Bear to really do much. They had figured that they would just adopt the Mexican fortifications in the town. The two civic plazas have been fortified. The Plaza de las Islas is the one that's furthest east, and then the civic plaza, the military plaza, is the one that's furthest west. And San Fernando Cathedral divides the two. It's two great big parade grounds. There's been trenches dug, barricades dug. The tops of buildings have been fortified. It's a big fort. San Antonio is a big fort. And we go through there now, and we're driving down Commerce Street, and we're looking around San Antonio. We don't see a fort. We just see traffic. There's the Briscoe Museum. There's the river kind of over in the distance. I think I'll go over here to Boudreaux's and have, some tableside avocado guacamole. So we don't think about that being a battlefield because we're so fixated on the Alamo. But that was the garrison. That was the fortification that Bowie and Travis first occupied. But they only have 150 guys. And not only that, these are 150 guys that really don't think that Mexico is going to respond because they think that troubles elsewhere in Mexico will make Texas very low on their list of priorities. So what ends up happening is they get surprised. Bowie and Travis get surprised. And they look up one day and the Mexicans are about 2 hours outside of town. And it's like, what the heck? Well, it's not like people hadn't been telling them, because a bunch of their allies are local Tejanos or Bejareños that have been riding down to the Rio Grande counting flags in hats and going, there's a lot of these guys and they look kind of cranky. And they'd come back, ride in, say, hey guys, They're coming. Nah, they won't come. They're just up on the Rio Grande. They'll never come this far. Well, they did. So then they had to cough up a plan on the fly. And coughing up a plan on the fly meant getting back to the Alamo, because that was at least more defensible. But then they're stuck.
So how did Sam Houston come on the scene?
All right. Sam Houston, of course, had been governor of Tennessee, had a terrible wrecked marriage, and we don't know why that his marriage fell apart. But he essentially crawled inside a whiskey bottle, pulled the stopper in behind him, and became a drunk and went out to disappear into the West. He'd had this long relationship with Cherokees. Cherokees been removed to the West, or at least some of them had removed to the West. And he starts a new life as amongst the indigenous peoples of what is now Oklahoma. Had a wife, had a daughter apparently. And finally the Cherokee said, well, look, why don't you make yourself useful, Sam? You know Cherokees, you know English, and you know all the politicos up in D.C. Why don't you go up there and represent our interest in D.C.? And it's there that he's reunited with his political mentor, Andrew Jackson. And we don't know exactly what transpired. We don't know what happened in their meeting. We do know that he made himself kind of persona non grata by trying to kill a Ohio congressman. Sam Houston threatened him to a duel, and they were about to throw down and kill each other on the streets of D.C. So next thing you know, Sam Houston goes back to the Indian Territory near Tahlequah, takes off his Indian clothes, puts on his white man clothes, splashes across the Red River, and he's back in Texas. So some speculate that Sam Houston was an agent of the American president. Others speculate that he was a man on the make trying to rebuild a political career. But whatever the case, he comes back to Texas and he starts scheming. And his scheme is always to try to lure the Mexicans into extending their supply lines deep into Texas and get essentially spark some sort of confrontation between American interest in East Texas and Mexican interest on the northern frontera. Problem is, the people that Sam Houston was trying to pull all in the same direction were all pretty hard-headed and independent-minded. As the old saying goes, they're as independent as pigs on skates, And so Sam had to manipulate not only American politics, but also the Texian politics, and turns out he was pretty good at it.
So I'm going to go back to the book because we get up to the Battle of the Alamo, and I thought the authors were good at really conveying just the sense of terror and the viciousness of the hand-to-hand fighting that went on.
Oh, absolutely.
And sometimes that gets lost in military history, and sometimes it gets lost in the telling of this tale, but I thought they did a good job on that. They said one thing that I had not heard. I can't disagree with it because it does make some sense to me that there was some group that got outside the walls and fought with the cavalry, and that makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah.
Is that, you give that any credence one way or the other?
I do. It's interesting. The men that found themselves trapped in the Alamo weren't crazy about it. They were used to open field fights. These guys had used long rifles to good effect at the Battle of Concepcion, for instance. They're used to picking people off of rooftops and things like that and coming around and finding their flanks. Now all of a sudden they're the ones in the cage, and the Mexicans keep advancing their artillery in a classic siege fashion. So they're having to sit there and take it. They're just getting pounded. And they're longing for the day when they can show their prowess out in the open field. But it's not the case. They're just not going to get that opportunity. So they had agitated about not being trapped like that, and the numbers actually vary. Some people say that there may have been as many as 250 in the garrison at the Alamo. One thing's pretty clear: the Mexicans were really good at throwing a siege, and the Centralist forces kept pounding the Alamo until one day they just stopped. And when they stopped firing their cannons, all the guys on the inside said, "Oh man, that is awesome. Now I can finally get a good night's sleep." Well, all they're doing is setting them up to be overrun. And so that's a classic siege operation. Deprive the enemy of sleep, deprive the enemy of comfort, have them worried about what's going to come over that wall and blow up in the corrals or in the outhouse or in the church or wherever, so long that the guys inside are just always tense. And they're tense for the better part of 2 weeks. And so when the assault finally comes, I think that it happens a lot faster than they thought it would. That north wall, the Mexicans actually get a battery of artillery. The Mexican centralists get a battery of artillery within about 150 yards of it. I mean, that's a football field and a half. And they're pounding it. And so when those guns go silent, people nod off. And when the assault comes, it nearly fails, but once they breach that north wall, it's just a matter. So when the north wall is breached, and for folks that go to the Alamo, we're talking about the Federal Post Office and the Emily Morgan Hotel is actually where the breakthrough happens. Once that occurs, the fighting then shifts over to the long barracks, which means that if you're on the west wall, where you've successfully repelled several assaults, the enemy's now behind you and not in front of you. So do you turn around on that west wall and shoot into the enemy, or do you say, this is bad. The bad guys are on the inside, but they're not on the outside, so I think I'll jump the wall and make a break for it. And essentially it's like rolling up a tube of toothpaste. I mean, it gets squeezed out somewhere, and they got squeezed out from the west wall, squeezed out from the palisade between the church and the main gate, and that's when the cavalry did their job.
Right. So let me turn now to, I'm not even sure this is controversial, but the death of Davy Crockett.
Sure.
I guess we're both old enough to believe that he died fighting with either his rifle or with his knife or with his fist. Turns out that that may not have happened. He may have been captured and executed. To me, it really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
He died.
Dead's dead.
Dead's dead. But, I mean, that kind of history has been reported for probably 40 years.
Sure.
Does it really even matter?
No, it really doesn't. It's amazing because he is the rock star at the Alamo. People had heard of him. Even some of the centralist generals said, the naturalist David Crockett. They didn't really think of him as a congressman or any sort of major political leader. They just thought of him as a curiosity. Maybe a TikTok star or a, social media influencer. But he had some purchase amongst the folks that were inside the fort. So his is the most high profile of all the people that are there, and his death is the one that's fascinated the most. But if you take a look at the accounts at that time period, there are rumors that Davy has survived and has been forced to be a slave in a mine in Mexico. And in fact, Crockett's son puts together an expedition to go find his dad. And when he finally gets to Texas and starts talking to people before he plunges into Mexico looking for his dad at the salt mine, they say, no. If you're looking for your dad, you probably need a dust broom and some way to scoop up some ashes, because I think he's right over there. So that's the fascinating part about Crockett, is the story is actually a lot more fascinating on whether or not he went down swinging or got captured. I can tell you mentioned the brutality of the assault. There is a lot of metal flying across that courtyard. It is conceivable to me that he is overwhelmed. He might have even been wounded, or he may have just been out of rounds, out of gun, and out of options. And so, if you're a politician of some reputation, you might have tried to talk your way out of it. And you can't kill me, man. I'm famous. Well, you're less famous over here than you are over there. So, nope. You got to go. In fact, you might even your execution might even send a stronger signal than just executing some 19-year-old kid from Georgia. You're the David Crockett. So there's a lot of reasons why it doesn't really matter how he went down, but he does go down. He becomes kind of the face of the martyrdom in many ways.
So why do you think Santa Anna gave the no quarter order literally for the entire campaign, and what effect did that have on Sam Houston and the Texian Army?
Well, it was a miscalculation, but it was part of Mexican law. So the Secretary of Defense, essentially, the war minister in Mexico City, is a guy by the name of Tornell. And Tornell is one of Santa Anna's guys. And he says, look, what should our policy be about these guys? And Tornell says, look, it's pretty simple. These are not Mexicans. These guys are American adventurers, pirates. These guys are pirates. So what do you do with pirates? Well, on the open seas, you hang them from the yardarm. I mean, you have a drumhead court, and then you hang them. So if you're hanging them out in the Gulf of Mexico, I guess you line them up and shoot them if you take them on land. And so that's the Tornell decree sets all that up. So the question is, do you actually enforce the Tornell decree or do you not? Well, it's Santa Anna's own government, so of course he's got to enforce it. But not everybody that's in the Mexican army is a devout centralist. Some of them are career soldiers who have federalist tendencies. And so there is some resistance amongst some of his staff officers and commanders in other theaters, like down at Goliad, against executing the prisoners. I said, man, this is going to have a bad effect. And Santa Anna says, look, rules are rules. These guys knew the rules, whack them. And so that's kind of what happens. But now all of a sudden it's a zero-sum game. I mean, you've got to win or die. And so the third option is you can just run out of Texas and be done with it. And actually, the government of Texas outlaws fleeing Texas. Now, it doesn't stick, doesn't have any teeth, and a bunch of people do flee Texas. But a bunch of them said, no, this guy has slaughtered our friends, our neighbors, our kinsmen. It's payback time. But Santa Anna figures that he's got a little bit of a hubris thing going. He thinks that this has scared the bad guys enough that they're all running out of Texas. We're going to wrap this thing up pretty fast.
So, Don, we had a centennial, obviously, the Battle of the Alamo. We had a sesquicentennial. I hope I'm around to see the bicentennial.
Yeah.
We both studied this, certainly all of our adult lives, and I think going back into young childhood.
Yeah.
How should we remember the Battle of the Alamo today?
It's interesting. I get that question a bunch, especially from folks that are moving to Texas from other states and from other countries to a lesser degree. But they're always trying to figure out what the Texas secret sauce is. You know they want to live here. They know they want to invest here. They want to bring their businesses here, but they don't understand what the Texas secret sauce is. You know, what is it that makes Texas so doggone Texas-y? I would say that the Alamo created a Genesis story. It's the creation myth, and it's been mythologized to a lesser or greater degree. But that's the point of origin. Yeah, it's interesting. The Greeks have this concept of Delphi, the city of Delphi, the town of Delphi, as being the navel of the earth. And that's from whence everything springs, all of civilization springs. Of course, Jerusalem has that similar function, Mecca, Rome. We all have our sacred sites that are the wellspring of our civilization. The Alamo is that wellspring. And whether Davy went down swinging or not, whether the Mexican centralists were completely justified in trying to tamp down this insurgency or not, whether the insurgents were absolutely correct in saying that we're going to fight to preserve the Constitution of 1824, we're going to fight to say rules are rules and we're rule followers and y'all change the rules, or whatever they're fighting for, doesn't matter. The event happened. And that event happening has created this sort of touchstone for Texas civilization. So then you have to ask yourself, if I don't want Texas to have a touchstone, then we should make the Alamo into something that was icky. and disgusting. And so therefore all the guys inside the walls were probably evil, disgusting, people with bad motives. All right. We've seen that happen in books, and most recently the book that came out last summer. And you have others that say, well, this is the beginning of some sort of institutionalized racism against Tejanos. And so the Alamo's icky and should be bulldozed. I tend to take the view that the Alamo as a military event is kind of a small affair, like Santa Anna said. That's how you describe it, but a small affair. Nobody's going to remember this dump. But as the idea that people will stand up for principle to the point of sacrificing their lives, taking that risk to defend something they hold sacred, I think is a universal human yearning. If you don't believe me, just take a look at the streets of Kiev. They're creating their own, Ukrainian Alamo now. Now, I hope they have a happier outcome than the guys did in 36. But that idea that they're going to fight for principle and for their homeland and for all that they hold dear, their wives, their children, stuff like that. That's what was going on that day. Whether you like it or not, and whether you think that the motives of the guys inside the walls were pure and honest, these guys were willing to stand up for what they believed. And any example of that in human history lifts our souls. It's an apotheosis where all of a sudden we are better than our base selves, because our natural instincts are to run for it. The old joke is, if there'd been a back door at the Alamo, there'd be no heroes in Texas. Well, maybe. Those guys knew they were trapped, and they could have tried to run for it in onesies and twosies. They could have done some sort of ruse and left their campfires burning and kind of slipped out on tippy toes or something, because it was an incomplete siege. But ultimately they said, no, what we're doing here is important, and what we're standing for is important. And I think where they may have come up short is they placed way too much hope in their fellow countrymen to come to their aid. They kept waiting for the reinforcements to come, and they just didn't show up. But I think Santa Anna feared that they might. So that's why I think he launched that assault when he did, how he did, because he knew that if he dragged this out any longer, there's no telling who's going to come over that horizon. So that's how I think about the Alamo.
Well, Don, I wanted to record this podcast for you for quite some time, so I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me. I'm going to post this puppy this week so everybody can hear this and then enjoy the anniversary of the battle and think about some of the things that you talked about and ended up with, because I think it is important, and I don't think we should ever forget.
Nope. Don't forget the Alamo.
This is Tom Fox. I hope you've enjoyed this special episode of the Hill Country Podcast. If you're interested in Texas history at all, I would urge you to check out the Texas Institute at Schreiner University. We're going to link to it in the show notes. It's one of the best resources for all things Texas history that I've ever come across. Also, I hope you will celebrate the anniversary of the Battle of the Alamo, which of course is on March 6th. If you have a story you would like to tell and you live in the Hill Country, I hope you will contact me. I want to tell the stories of the people, places, and things that make the Hill Country the most unique part of Texas. I hope you will join me in this exploration of love. Thanks so much for listening.